The midday sun beats down on a cracked sidewalk in downtown Chicago. A black Mercedes rolls to a stop in front of a bustling cafe, its tires screeching as if to demand attention. The doors fly open, and out steps a well-dressed man with a smug grin plastered on his face. Let's call him Brad. He looks around with a swagger, his expensive suit barely creasing as he locks eyes with a lone figure sitting at a street corner. A tall, slender man in his 30s dressed in worn-out clothes holds a cardboard sign that reads, "We'll work for food." His face is weathered, his eyes tired, but there's an undeniable dignity in the way he holds himself. This man's name is Jamir, a black immigrant who's been scraping by ever since he arrived in the States, hoping for a chance at a better life. But today was different. Brad steps forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't belong here," he sneers, glancing over Jamir's appearance with disgust. "Go back to where you came from. This country isn't for people like you." The words hit Jamir like a slap in the face. He flinches but doesn't respond, keeping his head low. The cruel mockery in Brad's tone is unbearable, but Jamir holds his ground. The crowd nearby watches in silence, some looking away, others too uncomfortable to intervene. But then, as if on cue, the world seems to pause. The wind picks up, and the sun blazes brighter, almost mocking the scene. Brad's eyes widen as his phone rings. He picks it up, still glaring at Jamir. His face goes pale.
"What?"
he yells, his voice cracking.
"No, that's impossible."
A chill runs through the onlookers, and the air feels thick with tension. Brad stumbles back, his grip on his phone tightening, before he starts shaking his head as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. But it's not a nightmare. It's real. And what happens next? Well, let's just say, karma has a twisted way of making things right. Now, what's really going down here? Stick around, because we're about to find out. Jamir had been in the States for almost 3 years now, but the dream of a better life still felt distant. Each morning he'd wake up to the same grim reality. A small rundown apartment in the heart of Southside Chicago, barely bigger than a closet, with peeling paint on the walls and a mattress that sagged in the middle. The faint smell of mildew lingered, but Jamir had grown used to it. He couldn't afford to complain, not now. Not when he had his family back in Ghana to send money to. When he first arrived, Jamir had dreamed of something more, a job that paid enough to live without counting pennies, a home where he could feel safe, a future where he didn't have to feel like a ghost, invisible in a crowd. But it wasn't that simple. The system was stacked against him. And as much as he tried to remain optimistic, reality slapped him in the face every day. His work as a delivery driver barely covered rent. And every night he found himself navigating the harsh streets, hoping that he'd get a tip that would make the difference between eating dinner or going hungry. Today was like any other. He stood on the corner near a busy cafe, hoping for some change to get by. His back was aching from delivering parcels all morning, and his stomach growled in protest, but he knew he couldn't stop yet. Not when he was so close. As Jamir held up his sign, he couldn't help but watch the people passing by. The rush of their lives, the quick glances they threw at him before quickly looking away. It was as if he didn't exist to them. It wasn't just the busy folks in the suits and heels, though. It was the feeling that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to fit in, he'd always be other. The invisible man in the crowd, just trying to make it in a world that didn't care. And then there was Brad. Jamir had seen him around before, probably from some high-rise office downtown. The kind of guy who looked like his world came with a silver spoon in hand. Always clean-cut, crisp suit, shoes that probably cost more than Jamir made in a month. Every time Brad walked past, Jamir would brace himself for the inevitable look of judgment. It wasn't like he hadn't seen it before. People like Brad seemed to have a talent for making him feel small. But today was different. Today, as soon as Jamir spotted Brad strutting down the sidewalk, his gut twisted. Look at this. Brad sneered under his breath as he slowed down in front of Jamir. Another one of those migrants just taking up space, can't even look after himself. "This city doesn't need you." Jamir's heart sank as Brad's words punched through the air. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that, but for some reason, it stung more today. Maybe because of the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. Maybe because in his bones he knew Brad had no clue what it was like to be in his shoes. To come to a new country with nothing but hope and a sense of survival, only to be treated like garbage. Brad didn't stop there. He took a few steps closer, grinning like a cat that had just found a mouse. "You think you're entitled to anything here? You think you belong?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Jameer could feel his pulse quicken, the heat of embarrassment rising in his chest. His first instinct was to snap back, to let Brad know that he wasn't a worthless piece of trash. But he knew better. Anger wouldn't get him anywhere. He'd learned that the hard way. So instead, he forced himself to look down, feeling the weight of the judgment crush him under its pressure. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. People glanced over their shoulders, some of them shaking their heads in silent disapproval, but nobody said anything. They were all too scared, too used to keeping their heads down and ignoring the ugliness around them. But then Brad's voice came again, louder this time, crueler. "Maybe you should go back to your country. It's people like you who ruin everything here. You'll never amount to anything." For a moment, Jameer just stood there, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. He wanted to say something, anything, to put Brad in his place, to remind him that he was human too, that he had dreams and a life worth living. But Jameer couldn't do it. Not today. The crowd had gone quiet, but Brad wasn't done. He turned on his heel and glanced at the onlookers, his voice rising. "If we don't start taking our country back, it's all going to go to hell. People like him, people like you, just taking whatever they can get. It's disgusting." Jameer felt the weight of those words, but deep down, something inside him snapped. He had to remind himself that he wasn't Brad's problem. He wasn't anyone's problem, but the truth was, as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the reality of being a black immigrant in America. He knew the rules. He'd learned them quickly. No matter how hard he tried to fit in, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people like Brad who saw him as less than. As Jameer forced himself to breathe through the sting of humiliation, he couldn't help but wonder, how long could he keep taking this? How long until he couldn't ignore the pull of anger, the call for justice, the desire for something more than just survival? What he didn't know was that karma had already started its work. And today? Today was the day everything was about to change. Just as Brad turned away, smirking to himself, Jameer couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something that would tip the scales. He didn't know when or how it would happen, but he felt it deep in his gut. This wasn't the end. The universe was watching. And sometimes the smallest moments can spiral into the biggest changes. What Jameer didn't realize yet was that today he was about to get the kind of payback that only karma could deliver. And Brad? He had no idea what was coming his way, but the clock was ticking, and everything was about to flip. Stay tuned. The days blurred together for Jameer as he continued to scrape by, each one a battle in itself. But today felt different. Maybe it was the burn in his legs from walking all over the city, or the strange heaviness that had settled in his chest. He couldn't shake it. The weight of Brad's words still clung to him, like a stench that wouldn't wash off. Jameer had learned early on that in a place like Chicago, people didn't always treat you like a person. Sometimes it wasn't about the loud insults or in-your-face racism. It was the little things, the quiet things that hurt the most. Those were the ones that stuck with you, gnawing at your spirit until you couldn't ignore them anymore. Like the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming, clutching their bags just a little tighter. The way some cashiers would pretend not to see him at the counter, as if he wasn't worth acknowledging, even when he was standing right in front of them. And the looks that cut deeper than any words could. Those sideways glances full of judgment, full of othering. It wasn't just that he was black, it was that he was a migrant. He wasn't one of them, and that was all anyone needed to know. It was these little things that made Jameer question his worth on a daily basis. Every time someone ignored him, every time someone looked at him like he was a problem, it chipped away at his soul just a little bit more. But the worst part? The worst part was how he had become numb to it. He was so used to this treatment that he barely even noticed it anymore. He just kept moving forward, doing whatever he could to make it through the day. That morning, Jameer had been assigned to a new delivery route in one of the wealthier neighborhoods, a place where people lived behind gates, their lawns manicured like they belonged in a magazine. As he approached the address, his hands tightened around the delivery bag. He didn't belong here. The towering houses, the pristine cars, the immaculate yards, they all screamed wealth, privilege, and a life he'd never have. The house he was delivering to was a mansion, sitting on the corner of a cul-de-sac surrounded by a white picket fence. The driveway stretched out like it was made for a fleet of cars, and the mailbox gleamed with a polished finish. Jamir hesitated for a moment, eyeing the large stone pillars flanking the entrance, feeling smaller than he had in days. But he had a job to do. He couldn't afford to hesitate. When the door swung open, a woman in her 50s stood there, a look of surprise flickering across her face as she took in Jamir's worn clothes and tired eyes. He could already tell what she was thinking. Another delivery guy. Doesn't belong here. Oh, you must be the one delivering the package, she said, her voice cool and distant. Right on time, I see. Jamir nodded, trying to maintain his professionalism, but her tone stung more than he expected. He handed her the package, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. She didn't flinch, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Jamir feel invisible. It wasn't just the fact that she was well off. It was the way she looked at him, as if he was a mere object, just another cog in the machine. I didn't expect to see someone like you working here, she said, her gaze flicking to his clothes. Must be tough, huh? Tough. Yeah, it was tough. But Jamir didn't answer. He couldn't. He just forced a smile, nodded, and left her doorstep, feeling like a ghost. It wasn't the first time someone had said something like that. But it was the first time it had made him question everything. Why was he here? Was he really just some other who didn't deserve to be in the same space as people like her? The thought gnawed at him as he walked back to his car, the bag heavy in his hands, his mind spinning with the same tired questions. Am I ever going to be enough? That evening, after another day of driving and delivering, Jamir found himself back on the corner of that cafe. He wasn't really expecting much. Just a few dollars in change, maybe a cup of coffee if he was lucky. But today, as he stood there, he noticed something different in the air. It was the same hustle of the city, the same busy streets. But today something felt more charged. There was tension in the air, like a storm was waiting to break. And then there it was, Brad. He strutted past, looking as smug as ever, his phone glued to his ear, clearly too busy to notice Jamir standing right there. But as soon as he passed, he shot a glance over his shoulder. Jamir couldn't be sure, but he thought he saw something flicker in Brad's eyes, something that almost felt like recognition. No, I'm imagining it, Jamir thought to himself, brushing it off. He doesn't care. He doesn't even know who I am. But then, as fate would have it, Brad stopped in front of a fancy restaurant just down the street. Jamir could hear the faint hum of his voice from where he stood, his words cutting through the air. I don't know, man. These damn immigrants, they're everywhere. I'm just trying to make a living, and it's like they're everywhere I look. It's exhausting, Brad said to someone on the phone. Why should we have to share this country with people who don't belong? The words hit Jamir like a punch to the gut, but there was something deeper in Brad's tone that made his skin crawl. It was the kind of casual hate that slipped so easily from people like Brad's lips, the kind that was rooted in centuries of systemic oppression, the kind that built cities, economies, and power structures on the backs of people like Jamir. It was the kind of hate that didn't need to be screamed from the rooftops to be dangerous. It was dangerous because it was normalized. Because it was so ingrained in the fabric of American life that nobody even batted an eye. As Jamir stood there, trying to process what he'd just overheard, a sickening realization hit him. The city wasn't just indifferent to him, it hated him. Not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. His skin, his accent, his very existence. But it wasn't just Brad. It wasn't just the microaggressions or the looks of disdain from the well-to-do folks in the streets. No, it ran deeper than that. This was a system that treated him like he was invisible. A system that kept him fighting for scraps while others lived in mansions, and that was when it hit him. If he didn't fight back, if he didn't stand up for himself, nobody else would. The silence around him, the silence of people who saw it happening and didn't do anything, was just as dangerous as the words Brad spoke. Jamir didn't know how he was going to fight back, but deep down he knew something had to change. He couldn't keep being the quiet, invisible man who just took whatever was handed to him. The only question now was how. How was he going to stand up in a world that already saw him as less than? As Jamir made his way home that evening, the world felt different. It felt like something was shifting, like a crack in the sky was forming, and everything was about to break open. He didn't know what that meant for him yet, but he could feel it. Change was coming, and Brad? He had no idea what was about to hit him. It was just past 6 p.m. when Jameer's phone buzzed with a text, a delivery request. It was from a place he knew well, an upscale neighborhood just a few blocks away. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the address. This wasn't just any delivery, it was Brad's address. The house he'd delivered to a few weeks ago, the one with the tall iron gates and pristine yard. The one where Jameer had felt like a nobody. But this time, Jameer didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he was walking into. He grabbed the delivery package, threw on his jacket, and headed straight out. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but the strange feeling of unresolved tension had been building inside him since their last encounter. Maybe he'd get the chance to look Brad in the eye, maybe even say something. When Jameer pulled up in front of the grand mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be different. The driveway was lined with sleek black cars, but it was eerily quiet, no sound of life inside. He rang the doorbell, feeling the familiar sting of doubt creeping into his chest. The intercom crackled to life. "Who is it?" Brad's voice was as pompous as ever. But this time, there was a hint of annoyance, almost as if he already knew who was standing at his doorstep. "It's me, Jameer. I have your delivery," Jameer said, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a long pause before Brad spoke again. "Just leave it on the doorstep. I'm not coming down. I've got company." Jameer stood there for a moment, confused. Brad didn't even want to face him? He had expected some kind of confrontation, but this was worse. It felt like he wasn't even worthy enough to be acknowledged, to be treated like a human. Jameer felt the familiar sting of rejection, but this time, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to just drop the package and walk away. No, today was different. This time he wasn't going to let Brad treat him like an invisible ghost. Not again. He rang the doorbell again, louder this time. "I'm not just dropping it off, Brad. I'm not some delivery boy you can ignore. You owe me an apology for the way you talked to me before." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Jameer could hear the faint sound of footsteps from behind the door, and then it swung open. Brad stood there, his expression filled with irritation, his jaw clenched. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brad spat, his face turning red. He was angry, but Jameer wasn't backing down. "You can't just say what you said and get away with it," Jameer said, his voice stronger now. "You can't keep treating people like they're beneath you, like they don't matter." Brad's eyes flickered with something darker now, an anger Jameer hadn't seen before. "You think you can tell me what to do? You're nothing but a—" Before he could finish, Brad's hand shot out, shoving Jameer hard in the chest. Jameer stumbled back, but he didn't fall. He stood there, breathless, trying to process what had just happened. He was used to the looks, the subtle jabs, but this was different. This was outright aggression. Brad stepped forward, his finger pointing at Jameer's chest, his voice low and venomous. "You don't belong here. You're nothing. You think you can come into my world and tell me how to act? You think you have a place here?" The words hit Jameer like a slap to the face. His hands clenched into fists, but he couldn't bring himself to swing. He wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't here for a fight. But his blood was boiling, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt this humiliated, this small. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make Brad feel what he was feeling, but he stayed quiet. He took a step back and swallowed the lump in his throat. Brad, seeing that Jameer wasn't fighting back, smirked. "You're weak, pathetic. I'm not scared of you." That's when it happened. Jameer's mind raced, his emotions swirling. Everything he had been holding in, the years of quiet suffering, the constant microaggressions, the way he had been pushed aside by people like Brad, flashed before his eyes. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about Brad. It was about the system. The culture of oppression that had been ingrained in this country for generations. The people who thought they could walk all over others, just because of where they were born, or the color of their skin. The rage inside him built until it felt like it was going to explode. For the first time in his life, Jameer stopped being the quiet, invisible man. He wasn't just going to accept the hate. He wasn't going to stay silent. He looked Brad dead in the eye, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you treat like they don't matter. You think this world belongs to you? Well, I've got news for you." Brad's smirk faded slightly, confusion flickering in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. He shoved Jameer again, this time with more force. Jameer stumbled, but before he could steady himself, A sharp pain shot through his side. Brad had thrown a punch. The force of it knocked Jameer to the ground, his vision blurring for a moment as the concrete met his body. He grunted in pain, the world spinning around him. But then, something inside him broke. He couldn't stay down. Not anymore. With a swift motion, Jameer pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. His blood was boiling, his heart was racing, but this wasn't about physical pain. It was about standing up for everything that had been stolen from him. His dignity, his respect, his right to be treated as an equal. He wasn't going to let Brad or anyone else take that from him anymore. The world seemed to slow down as Jameer's fists clenched once more, his body trembling with the weight of everything he had been through. This wasn't just a fight with Brad. It was a fight against the system, against the hate that had been allowed to thrive for too long. But before he could make his move, Brad's expression shifted again. His face twisted, not with anger, but with something darker. Panic. Fear. Jameer didn't understand it at first. But then, as Brad stepped back and looked at him, Jameer saw something change in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. What the hell? Brad stammered, his face paling. What's happening? Jameer didn't know it yet, but karma was coming for Brad, and it was going to be far worse than anything Jameer could ever do to him. But what happened next was a twist neither of them had expected. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Brad's face was pale, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Jameer stood there, blood rushing in his ears, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Brad to break down like that. The man who had pushed him, humiliated him, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. What's happening to me? Brad's voice cracked, a tremor running through his words. Why can't I move? Jameer stepped back, confusion flooding his mind. He'd never seen fear like this in Brad's eyes before. It was almost as if the world had flipped on its head, as if the balance of power had suddenly shifted. Brad's hands trembled as he reached for the doorframe, trying to steady himself, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen. And then, slowly, like a switch had been flipped, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping for air, his face contorted in agony. The tension that had been building for weeks finally exploded in that one shocking moment. Jameer stood there, still processing what had just happened. His mind raced, trying to understand. Was this some sort of karmic justice? Was this the universe's way of showing Brad what it felt like to be powerless? Or was it something more? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Brad wasn't the same man anymore. The smug, arrogant persona had crumbled. In its place, a vulnerable, terrified human being sat on the floor, his world shattered. Jameer wasn't sure if he should feel bad for him. He wasn't sure if he should offer help or turn his back, but he couldn't ignore the truth. Brad had finally tasted what it felt like to be powerless, to be treated like nothing, just as Jameer had been treated time and time again. You're not so tough now, are you? Jameer's voice was low, tinged with anger, but also something else, a sense of satisfaction. Now you know what it feels like. Now you know what it's like to be pushed down, to have no choice but to take it. Brad looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. Please, he gasped, his voice breaking. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean what I said. The apology felt hollow to Jameer. It was too little, too late. Brad had used his privilege to tear others down, to elevate himself by crushing people like Jameer. And now that the tables had turned, now that he was on the ground, pleading for mercy, it felt like nothing more than a pathetic attempt to save face. You didn't mean it? Jameer scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. You've been saying things like that your whole life. You don't get to take it back just because you're the one hurting now. There was no satisfaction in it anymore. Only a sickening reminder of the deep-rooted biases that ran through every inch of this city. Brad's fear, his desperation, it didn't change the fact that he had spent his whole life with a sense of entitlement that he now realized wasn't invincible. But that wasn't the only thing that made Jameer pause. The deeper truth had been gnawing at him ever since he saw Brad's transformation. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about personal vendettas or payback. This wasn't just a random burst of karma. This felt orchestrated, like the universe had played a hand in making things right. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind for Jameer. Word had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People were talking, gossiping, questioning what had happened that day. Brad's sudden breakdown wasn't just a local incident, it was a scandal. The wealthy elite, who had spent so many years turning a blind eye to the systemic injustices happening around them, were now being forced to reckon with the reality of their own power. And Jamir? He was caught in the middle of it all, unsure of what to make of the chaos that was unfolding around him. He hadn't meant to become part of some larger narrative. He didn't want the attention. He just wanted to survive. He wanted to live without constantly feeling like an outsider in a country that wasn't built for people like him. But now, with Brad's fall from grace, Jamir was suddenly thrust into the center of a conversation he never asked to be a part of. Some people in the community rallied around him, supporting him, standing with him against the forces that had oppressed him for so long. Others, though, were less understanding. There were whispers, those who saw Jamir as nothing more than a troublemaker, someone who had stirred the pot and brought attention to issues that weren't his problem. The tension in the air was thick, and Jamir found himself at a crossroads. He could either take a step back, blend in, and let the world go back to the way it was, or he could push forward, stand up, and demand that the change he had ignited be more than just a fleeting moment of reckoning. But even as the days passed, even as the news about Brad's fall spread, Jamir couldn't ignore the silence of those around him. The people who had seen the injustice, who had stood by while it all unfolded. The ones who had looked the other way because it didn't affect them. The silence of inaction, of complicity, was just as damaging as the actions themselves. Jamir knew this all too well. He had been the silent one for too long. He had been the one to sit back and let the world pass him by, never daring to speak up, never daring to fight back. But now he had a choice. The question was, would he take it? He couldn't help but wonder if Brad's downfall was just the first in a series of events that would change everything. The world had a way of tipping over when people least expected it, and for once, Jamir was no longer afraid of what would come next. He stood by the window that evening, looking out at the city that had both crushed and shaped him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so small. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as unstoppable as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, the winds of change were starting to blow in his direction. But then, just as Jamir was lost in his thoughts, he received a call. It was an unfamiliar number. A part of him hesitated, but something told him to pick up. Jamir. The voice on the other end was low, guarded, but unmistakable. It was Brad. "I need to talk," he said, his voice shaky. "I need to explain myself." Jamir felt a pit in his stomach. It wasn't over yet. Jamir sat silently, the weight of the phone call pressing against his chest. Brad's voice trembled on the other end, full of something that sounded almost like regret. For a second, Jamir thought about hanging up. He thought about just moving on with his life, leaving the past behind. But something in Brad's voice, something in the vulnerability that seeped through, made Jamir pause. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Brad continued, his voice barely a whisper. "But I need you to understand something. I was raised to believe that people like you, people from where you're from, are nothing, that you don't belong here. But I see now how wrong I was, and I see the damage I've done." Jamir closed his eyes, letting the words settle in the silence of his small apartment. He'd never imagined a moment like this, never thought Brad would be the one asking for forgiveness, never thought he'd be the one standing on the other side of that power dynamic. But here they were. And the question in Jamir's mind wasn't whether Brad deserved forgiveness, it was what Brad was going to do with it. "Why now?" Jamir asked, his voice steady but cold. "Why the change? Why all of a sudden?" Brad hesitated. "Because what happened, it wasn't just me losing control. It was bigger than that. I saw the pain in your eyes. I heard the words I said, and I realized, finally, what they cost. Not just you, but people like you, everywhere. I've been blind, Jamir, and now I can't unsee what I've been doing." Jamir took a deep breath, his mind racing. Could he forgive Brad? Could he move past the years of microaggressions, the systemic racism, the quiet hate that had been simmering just beneath the surface of every interaction he'd had in this country? It wasn't easy. It wouldn't be. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than just a personal victory. Maybe it was the start of change. Real change. "Look, Brad," Jamir said, his voice softening just a little. "I appreciate that you're saying this. I really do. But this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's been pushed aside. Everyone who's been told they don't belong. This is bigger than both of us. Brad was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, a little firmer. I know. And I'm ready to do more than just apologize. I want to help. I want to change things. For real. Jameer couldn't help but smile. Maybe it was the first glimmer of hope he'd felt in a long time. Maybe it was the realization that things didn't have to stay the way they were. That maybe, just maybe, the wheels of change could be set in motion, one small conversation at a time. You want to change? Jameer asked, almost in disbelief. Then get to work. Start using your privilege to fight for the people who don't have a voice. Start listening. Start acting. Brad didn't answer immediately, but Jameer could feel the sincerity in his words. I will, he said, his voice firm. I swear I will. A few weeks passed, and the ripple effects of that day continued to unfold in ways Jameer never could have imagined. Brad kept his promise. He began to use his platform and influence to raise awareness about systemic racism, inequality, and the importance of allyship. He worked with organizations that focused on empowering marginalized communities, and he even reached out to Jameer personally to collaborate on initiatives aimed at bridging the divide between the wealthy and the oppressed in the city. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty. The backlash was immediate. People who had once admired Brad, who had supported him, suddenly saw him as a traitor. But that didn't matter to Brad anymore. He had seen the truth. He had seen the impact of his words and actions, and he wasn't willing to go back to the way things were. For Jameer, the path was just as complicated. There were moments of doubt, moments where he wondered if the fight was worth it. But every time he saw a small victory, every time he saw someone speak up or take action in the face of injustice, he knew it was. He kept moving forward, speaking out, and doing what he could to create change, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced for too long. The story of Jameer and Brad wasn't just about one person's redemption. It was about a system built on centuries of inequality, a system that often relied on people staying silent and passive. But it was also a story about resilience, about standing up in the face of hatred, about refusing to let that hate define you. In the end, Jameer realized something important. Change wasn't just about the people who perpetuated the system. It was about the ones who fought back. It was about the ones who refused to accept things as they were. It was about the everyday acts of courage, the quiet moments of resistance, that slowly but surely chipped away at the walls of injustice. But even as Jameer continued to fight for equality, for justice, and for a better future, there was one question that haunted him. How many other people were out there, just like Brad, waiting for the wake-up call? How many people were sitting in their comfortable, protected lives, oblivious to the pain and struggle of those around them? And how many of them would be willing to take a stand? Because Jameer knew one thing for sure, the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and it would take every single person who was willing to stand up, to speak out, and to make a difference. The real question was, would you be one of them? The answer, Jameer hoped, would be yes.